Welcome to this episode of Stranger Stitches, where I sit small fires in dark corners of crime and history. I'm rated PG for language and content. I also have to tell you, as a disclaimer, this is not a news story, but I promise you there's a lot of facts in here. So we're just folks sitting on the porch telling tales like folks do. So sit your fine ass down, buckle up, Buttercup. Today I take a look into what happens when the death care system goes wrong. Have y'all heard about those ashes that were found in the Nevada desert? Yeah, 70 piles of ashes. A couple months ago, I did an article about what happens when the death care system goes wrong. It'll both break your heart and turn your stomach. But those weren't isolated incidents. So here's a new one, and I'm here to take a stab at them yet again. Y'all, there ain't nothing quite as fucked up as finding out that someone's final resting place turned out to be a dirt road in the middle of nowhere. 70 piles of human cremated remains just get scattered along some remote Nevada back road like discarded food wrappers, which is also very tacky. You know we've hit rock bottom in how we treat the dead, and that's saying something in a world where funeral homes are already treating corpses like inventory in a warehouse with a clearance sale. Now, I've been digging through the absolute shit show that is Southern Nevada's cremation industry, and let me tell you, this desert discovery isn't some isolated incident of poor judgment. This is the inevitable result of a broken system so thoroughly corrupt by greed and negligence that dumping human remains on public land probably seemed like a reasonable business solution to someone. So picture this. You're driving down some dusty dirt road near Searchlight, Nevada. That's about 60 miles south of Las Vegas, where the desert stretches out like God's own graveyard, and you stumble across what looks like 70 tidy little piles of ashes scattered along the roadside, except they're not really scattered. They remain in little piles. Except these also are not campfire remains or some weird art installation. These are human beings reduced to pulverized bone fragments and dumped out there like garbage. The Bureau of Land Management is now knee-deep in a federal investigation trying to figure out if this constitutes illegal commercial dumping on public lands. See, here's the twisted legal distinction that matters. Individuals can scatter cremated remains on public land, and it's called casual use, and it's perfectly legal. But commercial operations, that's prohibited as hell on federal land. The fact that we're talking about 70 separate piles suggests this wasn't some grieving family holding a memorial service. This has all the hallmarks of a business operation gone rogue. Someone treating human remains like industrial waste that needed disposing of. So here's a couple legal loopholes for you. Nevada's laws around cremated remains are surprisingly permissive, and that creates a perfect storm for abuse because where there is a loophole, there is a crook. The state doesn't prohibit scattering ashes, and the land management also allows and condones it. But here's where things get murky. Yeah, when law generally prohibits commingling remains unless the deceased family or friends were there to do it, and the cremated remains must be reduced to particles no larger than 1/8 of an inch for the scattering. That's their laws and that's their requirements. These regulations exist to preserve dignity, prevent contamination, and maintain some semblance of order in how we handle the dead. But when you've got an industry in crisis, these same laws become loopholes that unscrupulous operators exploit. Can't store the bodies properly? Cremate them quickly and dump the ashes? Can't afford proper disposal? Find a remote desert road and dump your evidence there. So this desert discovery isn't happening in a vacuum. It's the latest chapter in what can only be described as complete systemic collapse of any standards at all. Take the McDermott Funeral Home. I ain't pointing no fingers, but I am naming names. Yeah, the McDermott Funeral Home and Cremation Services got shut down just weeks before this desert discovery made the headlines. State regulators found 146 bodies stored improperly, with some left uncremated for up to 252 days. Yeah, y'all, we're talking about bodies stacked up like cordwood leaking fluids left outside refrigeration in the Nevada heat. The place had a history of disciplinary actions dating back to 2021, but somehow kept operating until the situation became so egregious that even Nevada's apparently toothless regulatory system couldn't ignore it anymore. Then there's Heights Funeral Home in Henderson, which had its license suspended. Oh, big slap on the wrist there. In 2021, after inspectors found bodies stacked on top of each other. What is it stacking these bodies? Oh, and they found sheeting soaked with blood and a corpse stored warm to the touch outside of refrigeration. The Nevada Funeral Board noted a troubling, check this out, this is what they said, culture of decay among funeral homes, particularly when dealing with cases handled by Clark County Social Services. Basically, the most vulnerable populations are getting the worst treatment. You can't afford a pauper funeral? Well, they're supposed to take care of you, even if you get put in a pauper's field or your ashes, buried someplace or scattered someplace. They at least promise you that you're going to get some sort of respect in death. That didn't happen. Nevada law requires bodies to be buried or cremated within a reasonable time after death, but doesn't specifically state what reasonable means. When you've got facilities operating more like body warehouses and funeral homes, these timelines become meaningless suggestions. Behind all these regulations are real families dealing with unimaginable trauma. One Reddit user shared their ongoing nightmare. Yeah, they still can't find my husband's body after he passed away in 2020 during the COVID times. And then finding out he was cremated but moved, and now they can't find his ashes. This is not anything she approved at all and just really wants her husband's ashes or wants to know where he's at. Give him something respectful. And she can't move along because of that. Imagine living with that uncertainty, not knowing if your loved one was properly cremated, properly stored, or potentially among those remains scattered in the desert. And imagine that person couldn't stand the heat and says, whatever you do, take me to a mountaintop and release me someplace cold. I imagine that could happen. That might happen with me, who knows? Families are questioning integrity of the remains they have received from some of these troubled funeral homes, wondering if the ashes on their mantelpiece actually belong to their loved one, or if they're holding someone else's remains, or worse, fake ashes made from concrete dust. This crisis adds another layer of trauma who are already dealing with the loss and grief. And just let me recap what happened in Colorado. If you think Nevada's problems are bad, wait till you hear about this one. The Return to Nature Funeral Home, where 189 decaying bodies were discovered in conditions that made the medieval plague pit look like a well-managed funeral parlor. This wasn't just negligence. This was systemic fraud on an industrial scale. Evidence suggests that the funeral home fabricated cremated remains and records and gave the families ashes made from cement dust and animal bones. Families received what they thought were the cremains that had the consistency, what seemed like dry concrete. Yeah, and somebody got nosy about it, mixed it with water, and the fake ashes solidified. Imagine that. Human remains don't do that. A simple test that realized a horrifying truth. The Colorado case demonstrates how easy it is for unscrupulous operators to exploit grieving families. Real cremated remains are bone fragments without other material, meaning that no DNA can be extracted. However, RNA can be preserved, allowing experts to determine if the ashes were male or female and whether they were human or animal. But there's really not much else they can tell. Most families don't take the time or suspend their grief long enough to have the ashes tested, and why should they? Why should they? They can't trust that the funeral home has done its job that you paid them to do and be basically competent and honest. And isn't the bottom line always the bottom line? Proper body storage requires refrigeration, which costs money. Timely cremation requires scheduling and equipment maintenance, which costs money. Proper ash handling and storage requires space, systems, and containers, all of which cost money. The culture of decay noted by regulators likely stems from cash flow problems. Funeral homes may delay cremations to avoid paying crematory fees until they receive payment from families or insurance companies. Bodies pile up in inadequate storage while funeral homes wait for payment, creating the conditions as were cited at McDermott's and Heights. The desert dumping may represent the ultimate cost-cutting measure. Rather than paying for proper ash storage or returning the remains to families who didn't pay, someone apparently decided that plopping them down in the desert was a cheaper, more time-efficient solution. The Bureau of Land Management's investigation will likely focus on several key questions. Was this commercial dumping or individual scattering? Individual scattering seems unlikely. Can they trace the remains back to a specific funeral home? Were interstate commerce laws violated? And this could be a big thing. This could be the thing that trips somebody up. If any of those cremated remains ever cross state lines, that's a really big deal. And to me, the most important thing, how many families were deceived about the final disposition of Papa's remains? Federal involvement suggests this case could have implications beyond Nevada. If the dumping involved funeral homes that operate across state lines or the remains came from multiple states, federal prosecutors are going to come at this. The remote location of Searchlight kind of complicates things. It's a kind of place where someone could dump remains without being observed, so there's no witness. The evidence degrades usually pretty quickly in that environment. Wind, weather, wildlife could all scattered, cremated the remains, making it extremely difficult. And another thing I noticed, we don't know if this was the only time they got caught. There might be a lot more out there that we don't know about. And this problem didn't just develop overnight. They are results of years of inadequate oversight, toothless enforcement, and people just got used to the fact that they could get away with their shit. And, the worst that could happen is a little suspension. I'll get to that in just a minute. When McDermott's Funeral Home had disciplinary actions dating back to 2021, but continued operating until 146 improperly stored bodies were discovered, that's not regulatory oversight. That is regulatory negligence. When Heights Funeral Home could stack bodies in blood-soaked sheets and only face license suspension, not permanent license suspension either, they just had to correct their wrongdoing. Well, that sends a message that anyone in the industry can operate with minimal consequences. Now, let me break it down for you. Let's look at some of these perverse economics that make the cremation crisis not just predictable, but profitable. And these are some of the worst actors in the industry. Heights Funeral Home was fined $5,000 for multiple violations, including bodies stacked atop one another in blood-soaked sheets. Meanwhile, proper refrigeration cost the funeral home about $75 a day. So yeah, they avoided a whole lot. And direct cremation services average $995 in Nevada. So let's do some quick math that'll burn down this whole damn thing. If you're storing 146 bodies improperly like McDermott's did, and you delay cremation for an average of 100 days per body to avoid paying cremation fees up front, you're looking at proper refrigeration costs times times 75. That's $1 million. The exact number is $1,062,450 saved in refrigeration costs. Cremation fees avoided temporarily, $146 times $995, $145,270. So add that all up. The total avoided cost for that funeral home was $1,207,720. They were fined $5,000. Make that make sense to me. And the maximum fine is $500 per violation under Nevada law. You heard that right. Nevada's maximum penalty for practicing, improper funeral home stuff under their licensing agreement is $500 per offense. Even if regulators threw the whole fucking book at a funeral home, which they clearly don't, you're looking at maybe a few $1,000s in fines versus over $1 million in avoided cost. In 7 years, Nevada's funeral board executive director said that they had not suspended any other facilities besides Hite, despite dozens of consent decrees. The regulatory system is essentially suggesting that $500 will cover it. Here's something I wonder about. Does the IRS know about this? Remember Al Capone? He did a bunch of shady shit back in the day that he couldn't get caught on. They knew he did it. They just didn't have the evidence to stick it to him. But the IRS got him for tax evasion. When the G-man wants his money, he'll come at you both barrels blazing. Here's the beautiful irony. Nevada's funeral board might get caught with a slap on the wrist with $500 in fines, but the IRS don't fuck around when it comes to unreported income. If you're running a funeral home that's losing bodies, mixing remains, and potentially taking under-the-table payments to dispose of evidence, you're probably not declaring all that income on your 1040. Think about the cash flow implications. McDermott's had 146 bodies stacked like lumber while collecting payments from families and social services. Where'd all that money go? If you're being paid to cremate bodies, but dumping the ashes in the... Oh my goodness, and you're not returning them to the families? That's pure profit with zero expense. Well, if you have your own crematory and stuff like that, yeah, you're still zero tax reporting. I'm sure you can't explain where that money came from. And let's just stretch this out a little further. If these operations are taking side payments from criminals to lose the bodies in their system, that's a whole underground economy that's definitely not showing up on tax forms. The IRS has a hard-on for people who unreport cash businesses, and the funeral home that can't account for where bodies went probably can't account for where the money went either. Tax evasion charges don't require proving murder or evidence of tampering. Just show that someone's made money and didn't report it. While Nevada regulators play patty cake with their $500 maximum fine, the IRS can seize assets, freeze accounts, and send people to federal prison for decades. Maybe it's time someone tipped off the Criminal Investigation Division about funeral homes that seem to have more cash flow than corpses, because when Nevada's regulators don't do their job, someone in Uncle Sam's office might. So this isn't regulatory failure, it's a business model. When breaking the law is 99.9% cheaper than following it, and enforcement is rarer than an honest politician, dumping human remains in the desert starts looking like a reasonable quarterly cost-cutting measure. The desert dumping suddenly makes perfect economic sense. Why pay for proper ash storage or return cremated remains to families that didn't pay when you can just dump it out in Searchlight for the cost of gas money? The worst-case scenario is a fine that wouldn't cover a single day's refrigeration cost for all of the bodies you're supposed to be caring for. Enforcement mechanisms need to be in place. More frequent inspections, surprise audits, and criminal referrals for serious violators. You know why that place in Colorado got away with their shit for so long? Because there weren't enough people in the office to go and do the inspections. Yeah, they had even got the allotment for the money to pay them, but there was nobody to be paid. And I think the dishonest people know that, so they get away with their shit for so long. So y'all just be terrified along with me for a minute. How many of those remains scattered in the Nevada desert weren't just victims of funeral home negligence, but actual victims of violent crimes whose evidence conveniently got lost in the system? When you've got a funeral home with 146 bodies improperly stored, you're mixing remains, falsifying records, and operating with virtually no oversight. You've created the perfect infrastructure for evidence disposal. And if you're going to treat a human being like that, Why not treat the rest of them like that too? What the hell? It's just another body and all money is green. Think about it. What better way to make a murder victim disappear than to slip their body into a funeral home that's already treating corpses like inventory? Consider the economics from a killer's perspective. Nevada's maximum fine for cremation violations is $500 per offense. Meanwhile, a proper murder cleanup and body disposal can cost tens of thousands of dollars. Not going to tell you how I know that, but I know people who know people. And it carries life imprisonment risk. But if you can pay off a corrupt crematory operator and slip your victim into their already chaotic system, your evidence gets officially incinerated, mixing the legitimate remains and scattering it to the winds with all the government-issued death certificates and make it all look legal. The Lake Mead discoveries prove that Nevada's desert is already being used as a body dump ground. But those crude disposals, barrels in a lake, hoping they'd never be found, the cremation crisis represents something far more sophisticated, industrial-scale evidence destruction with official documentation. How many of those 70 piles of ashes in Searchlight contained victims of violent crimes? How many families are mourning loved ones whose remains were mixed with murder victims? How many killers are walking free because their evidence got lost in the system, so broken that funeral homes can't even tell you where the legitimate bodies are? The truly horrifying part is that we will probably never know. Once human remains are cremated and mixed, there is no way to separate the victims. Yeah, who is negligence from the funeral home and who is violent, killer, crime committer? Oh, it's so gross. The perfect crime isn't just possible in Nevada's death care system. It's profitable, it's systematic, and backed by regulatory authorities who treat mass violations with the same seriousness they do parking tickets. Nevada hasn't just failed to regulate the industry, it accidentally created a state-sponsored criminal enterprise where evidence destruction is cheaper than following the law, and murder victims can disappear into the legitimate death care system without a frickin' trace. I wonder if we knew the whole truth, how many unsolved mysteries and missing people and murder people, how many of that could be resolved if we just knew the whole truth. Consumer protection measures should include requirements for detailed documentation of the cremation process, a chain of custody records for the remains, and options for families to verify the identity of the ashes they received. The death care industry handles one of the most sensitive services in society. The standards and oversight should reflect that possibility. See? I had a Freudian slip right there. It's a possibility that they could be honest, but it's a probability that they might not be. And I don't mean to disparage the whole industry, because I know there are good people out there doing a good service, and I thank you for it. This story is not for you. You know what? I ought to do another story about when things go right. But that's not my channel. In a very difficult time for a family, we entrust our loved ones to the death care providers. We're placing our faith in them in an industry to handle one of the most sacred transitions in human experience with dignity, respect, and honesty. This parallels to Colorado's concrete ash scandal that suggests this isn't a regional problem but an ongoing national crisis in care standards. The families affected by this crisis deserve justice and assurance that such violations won't happen again. They deserve a death care industry that operates with integrity and compassion, not one that treats grief as a profitable opportunity. They deserve to know that their final act of love for a deceased family member won't be corrupted by fraud, negligence, and greed. The desert keeps our secrets, but this one has been revealed. Now it's up to investigators, regulators, and lawmakers to ensure that the dead receive the dignity they deserve and that the living can trust the industry charged with their final care. Now, I've got one more thing for you, and this is the frickin' chef's kiss. We are practically trolling future archaeologists from beyond the grave. Picture some poor PhD candidate in 2524 kneeling in the Nevada sand with their little brushes and measuring tools, convinced they have discovered the sacred scattering grounds of the ancient Nevadans. Because if all of the other rules were broken, that eighth-inch bone fragment rule probably wasn't cared for much either. They will write their dissertations about the ceremonial searchlight complex and the profound spiritual significance of the 70-person ritual dispersion pattern. Academia will be buzzing about this with theories. Was this a plague burial, a ritual sacrifice, evidence of the mysterious desert death cult that flourished in the 21st century America? Meanwhile, the actual explanation that some funeral home dickhead couldn't be bothered to properly do the ashes or the refrigeration cost. So, it will sound like cartoonishly stupid that no serious scholar would even consider it. Professor, what if they just dumped them there to save some cash? Oh, don't be ridiculous, Jenkins. No civilization would desecrate their dead for quarterly profit margins. This was clearly a sacred space. Kind of makes me wonder how many mysterious ancient burial sites were actually just historical assholes dumping bodies where they thought nobody would find them. So that's just my thoughts on the whole situation. I will update you if anything else comes of this, and I'm not sure it will, but we'll see what happens down the road. That's me for this time. Sweet dreams, y'all. See you next time.